Hello and welcome to another installment of At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a platform where we will learn from people who come from different walks of life, careers, and experiences, but all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of saying yes to the unexpected turns of their lives, and they are now using the power of their voice or podium to make an impact on the world we live in today. At the Podium is the intersection of art, culture, and big thoughts wrapped up in good old-fashioned conversation. Today, I'm thrilled and humbled to share the podium with Nora Zelevansky. Nora Zelevansky is the author of the novels Competitive Grieving, Will You, Won't You, Want Me, and SemiCharmed Life. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, Town and Country, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Vanity Fair, among many others. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband, 2 kids, and enormous cat, Waldo. Nora, welcome to At the Podium.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with how you became a writer and an author. I mean, I suppose it might be in your DNA based upon the family that you come from. And did you even really have a choice not to write based upon really who your family is and the sort of great artistic vibe and feel running through all 4 of you?
That's a good question. So so to explain, I grew up, as Patrick knows, in on the Upper West Side in sort of what might feel like almost like a J.D. Salinger-esque parody of the upper left side of New York City at that time, with a father who's a performance artist and a mother who was a contemporary art curator, a sister who Patrick knows extremely well, who was reading Proust when she was like 12, basically. Um, and growing up, my sister gravitated heavily towards performance and theater. And I gravitated a bit more towards like visual art, which is what my parents did. And they really emphasized um, like over and over again that I should not become an artist. They kept saying to me, like, don't become an artist, don't become an artist. And in some ways, I think about that sometimes and I think, well, I listened, but nobody told me that being a writer was basically the same thing. Um, but essentially, yeah, I mean, my mother was, before she became a curator, she was an art critic and a writer. And when Claudia, my sister, and I had essays due for school, she would sit us down at the computer and we would go line by line and do like an edit as if she was a magazine editor. Um, so she would say like, uh, that word is awkward. What's another word you could use? And it was really rigorous, but for some reason really fun also. And so yeah, I think it was a bit inevitable. Um, Part of me, I think they were sort of, part of them was like, we're like, maybe she'll become a lawyer, but that didn't happen for any of us.
Well, okay, so I think it's interesting what you just described about Lynn, your mother, sort of treating your essays in school like copy for an article
Yeah.
in a magazine, because part of your life before you started writing the books, did a lot of freelance writing for all these different publications. So you kind
Right.
of had that built in for you from the beginning.
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah, I mean, she tells a story about when I was like 15. She said to me, maybe you'll be a writer when you grow up. And I said, oh, no way. That's way too hard. I'm not doing that. um, but yeah, I ultimately, like, my first real foray into writing myself, as opposed to working with writers on other kinds of projects, was freelance journalism. And it is what I did for many, many years. And of course, I attribute not only the actual writing to the family I came from, but also what I wrote about, which was like an interest, all these interests that had been sort of, I had been introduced to as a kid in like food and travel and design and fashion. Um, were all things that ideas that I was raised around, um, things that were just integral to the way that I was brought up.
So how did you make that transition then? Because I think there are a lot of freelance journalists and writers who have that great American novel in them, or that book of essays or poems they want to write. How how did you make that transition? It's not an easy transition to make for people.
No, I think I was lucky in the sense that, so in high school I was like the editor of my literary magazine, and I always loved reading and loved writing. But my first love was really personal essay and creative nonfiction. So when I wrote essays, like not fiction ever, basically. And actually, as a kid, I used to always say that I thought I had no imagination, because I was mostly interested in stories about real people. I wasn't interested in like fantasies and like, monsters and fairies and those kind of, I just wanted to talk about like the Upper West Side of New York City. Um, and so in that sense, I was lucky because I had been doing the journalism for ages, and I was feeling just like a little bit like constrained and frustrated by having to write within the confines of these very specific publications that all have their own voices, because when you're doing that kind of writing, you use your own voice to an extent, but you really have to be, you know, fit whatever the brand is of the magazine itself. And so I had this wild dream on a trip to the Caribbean randomly. And I wrote it down and I thought, I don't know, maybe this is the beginning of something. And so I decided to do National Novel Writing Month. I don't know if you're familiar with what that is.
Tell us what National Novel Writing Month is.
National Novel Writing Month, otherwise known as NaNoWriMo, is a sort of a movement that happens every November, but kind of continues throughout the year as well, in which basically a community of writers, which is now like, I mean, I don't know how many people, it's like hundreds of thousands of people probably at this point, commit to writing at least, I always forget the exact number, but I think it's 1,677 words a day for a month. You can't edit, you can't outline, you can't go back, you can't decide you hate it and scrap the whole thing. You just have to like write through it. And for me, that worked really well because it didn't allow me to stop and sort of have the self-doubt give into it, trash it, or to spend, 100 years honing a single paragraph. It forces you to like, I think it's a really good exercise even for non-writers. Like it just forces you to push through. And for me, because I hadn't really written a lot of fiction before, it was really low pressure. I had no expectations for it. And so that I think made it easier. And then once I finished the draft, which was, as you can imagine, a hot mess, after writing every day for a month, like free form, I was like, I think there's something in this. And so I just worked really hard to hone it and make
Was
it.
that, were you writing SemiCharmed Life, your first novel? Was that what you were writing in this?
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. Yeah. Which actually does have an element of fantasy in it, which is kind of funny.
I, I mean, it has a huge element of fantasy,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I think, and it's so funny reading your work, knowing that that was your first novel. I think one thing that's very interesting about your work, Nora, is that it does have a high level of fantasy in it. Actually, in your work, there's a high level of, and if I'm wrong, please correct me. I'm just a fan telling you what I observe when I read your
No,
books.
I like it. Yeah.
But there's like a level of your books when I read where it's just slightly above reality.
Mm,
You know, you
yeah.
know, like in Semi Charm Life when she's flying in the invisible jet, right?
Yes.
And she's
Yes.
going to all of these really amazing places. And then at the end of the book, and then you always have the turn where like the reality drops in. And so in Semi Charm Life, she looks around, she's like, oh, these people really aren't great. They're kind of weird, odd ducks living in this
Yeah.
apartment in New York. And you have a similar kind of turn that happens in in Competitive Grieving, but I think that it's so funny that you say that you viewed yourself as not having an imagination, because the work is so imaginative.
Oh,
That,
thank you. Yeah, I actually think that's totally accurate, and something nobody said to me. I think that's really true. Actually, not to sort of again bring it back down to reality, but I think if I've learned anything about myself in the last year and a half of, you know, challenging pandemic, it's that I think I need to live a little bit above reality sometimes, in order to survive. Like I need the sort of extra dose of technicolor and optimism, kind of. So, and that's why even in a book like Competitive Grieving, which is about, loss, um, it's ultimately like a story about sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, or hope, because I think when you're writing a book, um, and I'm sure this is true of a lot of different kinds of creative work, when you immerse yourself in a play or in whatever it might be, you're really living inside of that for the period of time in which you're writing it. And my tendency is to want to write something that I want to live inside of, um, not something that's difficult to be in.
so you mentioned Competitive Grieving, which we're ostensibly talking about. And it's a story about loss and how various people handle the loss of a significant character in the book. I don't want to go too much deeper into it because I want people to actually really read this. It's really a fabulous book. But what was the genesis of this story for you?
So, I'd say, and I just want to preface this by saying, like, I'm always really direct about this, but I feel like it makes it feel like it's my story, and it's not. I swear, it's fiction. But, but in 2017, which I think was a very challenging year for a lot of people, the world just was feeling very, very unstable in many ways. I lost one of my best friends from growing up. And uh, I was pregnant. I was turning 40. Like it was a lot that year. And basically, a group of us were charged with putting together a memorial for him, and also sort of helping his family go through his stuff. And fortunately, he has like a wonderful, warm, lovely family that's not really like the family in the book. Um, but he had achieved a certain amount of fame as a um, musician. He was in a band that had been successful for a little while, um, and he was a very charismatic, gifted person who people just gravitated towards. And so when he died, it was like all these people wanting to clamor, not just for sort of stuff, but for recognition as having been like the most important person in his life, the most deserving of a right to grieve, and the arbiter of his story, like the expert on who he was. Um, and that was very difficult to navigate because he had all these different friend groups that were important to him during different periods of time in his life. And um, I started to feel like this is like there people didn't always behave very well, and I started to feel like, sort of turned off to it, and also feel like I was having trouble actually grieving in the midst of it, that I couldn't even find my own sort of experience in the bedlam. And at one point I was on the phone with one of my oldest friends who was also really close with him, and I said, it's like competitive grieving or something. And I said to him, you know what? I'm going to write a book, and it's going to be called Competitive Grieving. And he was like, okay, whatever. And then I did.
That
um,
too.
yeah, but
So
yeah.
go ahead, Nora. I'm sorry.
No, all I was going to say was, but the story I ended up writing wasn't my friend's story, and it wasn't my story, but it was inspired by the experience of having to try to navigate that aftermath.
And I picked up on that when I was reading the book, Nora, that it really wasn't about more than the stuff that everybody was trying to take and do whatever they were going to do with it. It really felt like they were fighting to really own Stuart, who's the character who passes in the book. And even, and it's, you know, the book has a lot of energy around this whole concept of who owns what story and even secrecy around stories. And I think it was fairly prescient of the time that we're living in now, but also I think really relevant because I think we're all kind of fighting for control of the narrative of what's happening in our lives right now. And that really resonated for me within the book.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I mean, interestingly, I wrote the book a while ago, and because of the 2020 election, a lot of books got put on hold, and mine was one of them. It would have been slated to come out in fall 2020, um, but instead, it came out in May 2021, and I was initially upset about how long it was going to take to come out. Um, and then it turned out to be this like accident of fate that was sort of, it proves the notion that what's meant, what's meant to be is meant to be, um, because right now in the world, I agree with you. We're all having this like collective traumatic experience that we're trying to navigate in the best way that we can. And we all have our own narratives of how to live it, of how we've lived it, of how it's going to look, how things might look in a couple months, all of that stuff. And I think we're all also mourning not just the loss of actual people, which is obviously an enormous, impact on our culture at the moment, but also mourning the loss of like a way of being, a way of living, a transition into a different time, really.
Mm.
And so the book ended up being relevant in ways like I could never have anticipated.
When you phrase it like that, it's highly Dickensian when you sort of talk about the epic shifting that we're sort of living in right now.
Mhm.
Now, if people are listening, they're going to be like, "This book is a downer," but it really isn't because I will tell you, there were parts in the book that I literally was screaming. I was laughing so hard, and I think that's one of the again, it's part of the gift of your particular writing is that the work is incredibly funny and you're dealing with it's not sarcastic because I don't think it doesn't comment on itself like that, but it really is funny. You're in a funeral and you want to laugh, and it's all those things that we're not supposed to do, but highly funny. How do you capture tone when you're writing? Because I think what makes the book really successful and your other books really successful is that you're able to capture tone. And so if a person is writing, how do you even go about that process? Is it part of your innate Arthur's voice, or is it something that you study, practice to deliver to the reader?
You know, First of all, thank you. Like when somebody tells me that they laughed out loud during the book or cried, I'm like, I did it. Um, I really appreciate that. Tone is an interesting thing because there have been points at which I felt like I was writing in not really this book, but like for instance with Semi-Charmed Life, where I felt like the voice was so and the tone was so specific that I was fearful that if I like read the wrong other book, like someone else's book while writing it, or if I stepped away for too long, that I wouldn't be able to step back into the voice.
Mm.
Um, in competitive grieving, um, I I think it's mostly just I want to say that there's some like amazing tip I could give for like writing in a particular tone, but I think it's just kind of my worldview. Like I process almost everything through humor. It's the way that I survive. So and what you said, which just made me smile so much, and like nobody's expressed it that way, but it's the idea that the book makes you do all those things you're not allowed to do. Um, it is sort of like writing about grief through in fiction is sort of like this chance to experience all of those sort of ups and downs without anybody watching you, like vicariously, I guess. So to me, like the surviving like grief is the laughter is like everything, being able to see the absurdity of something in a specific situation. It's like, otherwise, how do you survive? And I realize not everybody works that way, but that's definitely sort of the way I approach life. And so I guess that sort of comes through in the book, but also, and this just goes to what I like to read, like, I don't mind like dark topics, but a relentless darkness I can't really get into. And so I need the lightness both when I'm reading and when I'm writing.
Because I think within the book there is, we're sort of on this path, and like an onion, the truth about who these people are starts to be revealed. And the truth of the circumstances start to really be revealed. And we're sort of left with, I think every character, even the secondary characters in the book, start in one place and finish in another, which is kind of really great storytelling. But also, when you're writing, do you know that destination in advance? Or does it reveal itself to you and take you there instead?
Yeah, I mean, I don't outline. I've tried to outline in the past, and I find that if I outline, I get bored. Um, and so I definitely don't have a very totally specific idea of where it's going, but I have a general idea of where it's going. And in the case of this book, as I know I kind of may have referenced to you before, just in terms of what you're saying, in terms of like the arc of all the characters, starting in one place, ending somewhere else, which is the goal. In my first draft of the book, the less likable characters did not have a very strong arc. um, I was like, I will not redeem them. But it ultimately, in service to the story, and also sort of in thinking about this idea of loss and the idea that, like, yeah, people behave badly and sometimes they do things they shouldn't do, but they're also like in a really bad place. And so we should have like more empathy than normal, at least, for them. And so, in order for Wren, the main character, to have an arc, really, they needed an arc too. She needed to be able to, she needed her worldview to open up. Um, in order for the book to have, an arc in that way.
Wren was a very interesting character for me, because one thing that you do really well in all of your writing is you take archetype and then you break it. Because I thought I knew who she was in that first scene in the book, right? I'm like, oh, I know who this girl is. And then as she starts to develop, and she does a lot of finger pointing at the other characters in the book. And I'm like, but you're actually trying to hold on to this idea of who Stuart was and your place in his life in a way that's exactly the way the vultures are doing. And it's really not until Blair's sort of redeeming monologue at the end where I feel like Wren gets it. And I had I kind of had a love-hate relationship with Wren in the book, because I was like, lady, come on.
Self-awareness. Yeah.
That is a drop of self-awareness. Was that the intention? That's my interpretation.
No, and yes, you're not alone at all. Yeah, I mean, she's flawed, and like interesting characters are flawed, I think. She's self-righteous a little bit, for sure, and she's definitely stuck, like in her spot. Um, and I think that notion of like a delayed coming of age, or like a breaking out from, this like specific narrative that we tell ourselves about who we are, is a huge theme in like all of my books. It's just something I guess I get really interested in, I think personally. I mean, this is a bit off topic, but like when I was growing up, I was like very comfortable socially. And in school, in high school and middle school, I was not awkward. I was like, you know, like I loved it. Like I loved all of it. I was like going out all the time and I had like my boyfriends and I like, whatever. I was like living it up. Um, and then I moved out of high school and I went to college and I was like, wait, how do I break out? It was as opposed to being somebody who wanted to break out into like a different version of myself. I I had to force myself to do it, more so. Like you can't stay in this. You may have liked it, but you can't stay in it. And it was, especially having left New York right at that time and I was in LA and sort of pining for New York in all these ways, like I really had to face this idea of how do you develop into a different person, again and again and again through your life, and I think that that's really why I'm partially why I'm like fascinated, by that idea. It's so easy to get stuck in a place, but we are forced, whether we like it or not, to reinvent over and over and over again.
I'm literally, I'm smiling and I'm getting little chills because the work that I'm doing for At the Podium and this book that I'm writing is really about encouraging people to break those norms and
Mhm.
to move themselves from plan A to plan B. Because to your point, you have to survive,
Yeah.
but also, could you have written your great books and the articles that you wrote if you hadn't made those shifts? Is a
Yeah.
really interesting question, right?
Yeah. Well, and what you were saying about the notion of deconstructing archetypes, or characters is something that I'm also really interested in. Like anytime in life, I s- I meet somebody who I think is a certain way, and then they say or express something or reveal something that makes me realize that they have like this like whole facet of themselves that has nothing to do with what I would have envisioned. It's like my favorite thing in the world. Like, and I often will like literally write it down to remember, like in terms of character development. um like I have a parent friend, like the dad of like one of my kids' friends, who I've known for a really long time, who I really like, who I see a certain way. And I literally 2 months ago found out that when he was like in high school and in his 20s, he was a rapper. And I was like, what? And I just love that so much. Like the incongruity in people to me is like the most interesting thing about humanity. And I think that's part of, in the book, there are those sections, or there's that sort of continuous theme where Wren starts planning people's funerals in her head, like strangers on the subway or bodega owners, or it could be like a friend of hers where she just is like, what would be the food, what would be the music, whatever. um and that is something that like I that it completely speaks to that idea of deconstructing people, that you can look at someone and you can sort of stereotype them, but if you can break the stereotype a little bit and bring in another element, like that's where the empathy is for people,
Mm.
you know
And just from a technical device, I love the planning of the funerals. Um, for all the characters that we know and the ones that we don't know, I thought it was a really interesting device, a literary device to reveal Wren, but also to reveal more about who these people were. And oftentimes I was like, yeah, definitely that, definitely
Right.
that um,
A
because it
friend of
was,
mine, a friend of mine actually texted me after she read the book and was like, I need you to plan my funeral right now. Like, she's like, tell me my things.
well, I could not stop texting you when I was reading the book. I mean, it's kind of the joy of knowing people who write really good books is that I can give you immediate like, oh my God, responses to what I was
Okay.
reading, which was great. I have a technical question for you. When you're writing, do you type? Do you write longhand? How do you navigate creating words?
Um, well, I type, but um, especially with kids, like small children, which they were especially small during the process of writing this one. Um, it's like I never know when I'm going to have an idea, and I never know when I'm going to have a chance to write something. And so I have written entire chapters of books on my phone in the notes app in the front seat of the car while they sleep in the back while Andrew, my husband, is driving. Um,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, like, and it used to be I would just jot something down in a notebook, but now, we have our phones handy all the time. It's easy just to jot things down in my notes app. But generally I write on my computer, I type. Um, I do see the value of writing longhand. I think it's different. And I do think sometimes if you're having trouble with something, you can almost write yourself out of it if you try doing it in longhand. Um, but I don't do it probably as often as I should.
And once you've written the manuscript or the book, what is the editing process like with your editors? What is that relationship like?
So this time was really different than with my other books. So my other two books were both published by St. Martin's Press, which is part of Macmillan. So it's like one of like the big publishers. And so they had, age old processes um, in place that actually they may have changed it now, but even in 2015 or 16 or whatever, while I was editing Will You Won't You Want Me, my second book, it still involved them sending me an entire paper, like printed out manuscript, and having me edit it by pen in a different color than them, and then mail it back, which is terrifying, by the way. Like, yeah, which is terrifying because at one point my editor was like, when are you going to send back the edit? And I was like, I sent it back 3 weeks ago. And she was like, oh, I never got it. And I was like, what? And it turned out it was like lost in the mailroom, and they eventually found it. But yeah, but yeah, so they were still sort of going by doing it that way, which is crazy. I have a feeling they may be doing it more digitally now, but this publisher that I worked with is a smaller publisher, and they had their own way of doing things. And they normally you have an editor who reads the book, loves the book, champions the book, convinces the publisher to buy it, and then they're your editor. And you go through the whole process with them. In the case of Blackstone, they have an acquiring editor who buys your book, and then it's passed on to in my case, like not even an editor for hire, somebody who they brought in from outside of the company.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the process, maybe because of that, was a lot faster, was sort of a hurry up and wait, but the actual editing process was much faster. And of course, because this is the way that life works, the pandemic hit. It was March 2020. And here I am with no childcare, two small children in fetal position in New York City. And the publisher's like, hey, okay, we're ready for you to edit. You have 2 weeks. And I was like, what? So, yeah, so I mean, it was hardcore. I mean, after I did the edit, I was like, I don't know if this was good or bad, or I don't know what happened, basically. So this was definitely a highly pressured edit, but also in some ways like a respite from worrying about the pandemic, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, write a book, edit a book. You know, what I'm curious because you've had great success in your career as an author and a writer. What part of your career took the biggest leap of faith that you didn't know what the outcome was going to be?
I mean, I think putting this book out into the world may have been the biggest leap of faith for me of all of them. I mean, the first book, like when they handed me the galley, like the press copy of SemiCharmed Life, I've never been that excited in my entire life. I mean, I went down the elevator and I got off on 3 wrong floors before I got down to the lobby. Like I was hi. And I got outside and I like held it to my chest and cried. I was so like excited. It's still so exciting every time you have a book come out, but it sort of becomes a different process. And in this case, because the book was inspired by the experience I had having lost my friend, it had a whole nother weight to it. Like it was more important to me than any other book I'd written that it see the light of day, as like a tribute to him. And also I was afraid that people might read the book and think it, even though it wasn't, that it was about the real people who I had this experience with. And I was worried that people might be angry or upset or see it differently, or, I didn't really know how it would be received. And then there's just the thing of putting something out in the world that's sort of a strange mixture of things in itself, or an unorthodox mixture of things in itself. And this was like a comedy about death. And and while that's actually a pretty common trope in film and TV, it's not in books really. So I just didn't know. I just didn't know how it would be. And I have to say, I mean, knock on wood, I've been so lucky. Like the response has been so positive. Um, People have been so awesome. And the amazing thing that's happened is that people, total strangers have started, and people who I know have started reaching out and sending me like notes about their own experience of loss, talking about how this is a part of loss that people don't talk about as much. And like that this is a chance to sort of examine that. And the fact that people share their stories with me, I mean, it makes me feel like it has an impact beyond just sort of entertaining people. Um, so, and then if my text from you, like those kinds of things where people are like, I'm in this and what, and this is happening. And like, it's the best. I mean, it's the best. So I feel really lucky to have had this during this difficult time also. Been such like a bright light for me,
Yeah. Well, I hope everyone who's listening to this goes out and buys this book, because it's definitely worth the read. I read it in one day. I couldn't put it down. Like it was like that for me. Yeah. Yeah. But Nora, thank you so much for your time today and your willingness to share your voice and wisdom with us. I am beyond grateful, thankful to you.
Thank you, Patrick. It was so great to talk to you. I appreciate you having me so much. It was so fun. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're gonna talk. We should do all 3 of your books, actually. That's what we should do. But thank you, everyone. And if you're watching or listening, remember we all have a voice. Use yours wisely. Bye, everyone.